Hi, I'm Alex and this is Tank Tested. Today, I'm going to be going through all the steps it takes to photograph an aquarium. In this instance, this stunning aquascape by my friend Ghazanfar. Here's a preview of the final result of this video. Full disclosure, I didn't take this photo. It was taken by my friend Gabriel. That's right, to make this video we needed 3 people. 1 to design the tank, 1 to photograph it, and someone to document the whole process. That last role is mine. I promise we'll go into detail on how to photograph a tank. But first, let's get an in-depth look into this scape itself. This tank is an ADA 90P. It's a rimless aquarium with a footprint of 36 inches across, 18 inches tall, and 18 inches deep. That means it has a volume of a little less than 50 gallons. At the time of filming, this tank was a hair shy of 6 months old. Here's what it looked like 2 months earlier when I visited Ghazanfar to film this tank that I shared with you earlier this year. Shameless link to that video in the description. Okay, back to the tank at hand. The hardscape is built with dragonstone, and the large central stone is given a sense of scale thanks to the scattering of rubble that forms the central pathway. This rubble is pretty easy to create. All you need is a hammer and a willingness to smash a few of your stones. Small fragments of your main stone can be critical to establishing not just a sense of scale, but a sense of time as well. The little rocks can create a sense of erosion and ancientness to the scape that mimics the way an old cliffside feels. With rubble and boulders in the valley below that broke free of the cliff face long ago. With the hardscape established, let's move on to the plants. In the foreground, Ghazanfar has planted Glosso. It's a small carpeting plant that really requires high light and high CO2 to thrive. If the light isn't strong enough, it'll get lanky and grow towards the light rather than carpeting. Without CO2, I have kept Glosso alive, but it barely grows at all. This really is a plant that has high demands, and it's not suitable for beginners. Hidden amongst the rocks are small patches of physidans, a type of moss that requires a good deal more light than your traditional Java moss or Christmas moss, which is good because this is a pretty high light aquarium. There are also patches of giant willow moss mixed in between the cracks in the hardscape. This is a pretty rare moss that's tough to find in the hobby, but it's a unique addition to this scape. Finally, there's a large grove of stems behind the hardscape. They have beautifully delicate leaves that are so fine that the scape actually looks larger than it really is. The catch is these leaves close up at night and the stems start to look more like cattails than feather dusters. This was a limiting factor as we photographed the tank, as the stems began to close as the night went on. The circadian rhythm of the plants meant that they began to go dormant and close their leaves, even though we kept the tank lit well into the night. To get the tank looking this good, it was heavily dosed with CO2, fertilized with a combination of Seachem Flourish Iron, and a mix of dry fertilizer of Ghazanfar's design. He also did a 50% water change every week. So let's talk about what this video is actually about, photographing an aquascape. The first step was adding a ring of black foam around the aquarium. There are a lot of bright lights involved in photographing an aquascape, and we didn't want any direct light shining into the camera lens and washing out our image. Now, this tank is already extremely well lit. Ghazanfar uses 4 T5 fluorescent lights over the aquascape, so we didn't have to pump much additional light into the scape itself. If your tank isn't normally this well lit, you might consider adding more light for a photo shoot. In the past, I've actually taken light strips from all my other aquariums and put them on just one tank in order to photograph it. But we'll get into why light is so important a little bit later in this video. While the aquascape itself is well lit, Ghazanfar's background wasn't. This tank has a translucent white film on its back that looks fine as is, but we really wanted that to be a bright glowing white background for the final photo. That's why we added a remote camera flash to the back of the tank. When the flash goes off, the backdrop goes from a light gray to a brilliant white. The next thing to focus on is the water's surface. Ghazanfar used a skimmer on this tank to get the surface crystal clear without any scum or loose leaves. In the days leading up to photographing an aquascape, you do a fair bit of trimming, but removing a leaf here or there leaves you with a lot of particles floating in the water, and a surface skimmer is the best way to get rid of them. We removed all the equipment from the tank for these photos, but the surface skimmer normally stays in the tank 24/7. I've left a link to this skimmer in the description. It's a pretty cheap way to elevate the beauty of your tank and keep your water crystal clear. With the surface clear, the last thing to do was whip out the hairdryer. It's the secret weapon of aquascaping photography. By aiming the hairdryer horizontally along the surface of the water, Ghazanfar is able to create ripples in the tank without any visible equipment. It's the closest thing to movie magic in the aquascaping world. Keep in mind, some tanks look better without surface ripples, and they can benefit from a mirrored reflection, but you should at least try the hairdryer trick to see if you like the result. After that, it's just a lot of fish corralling and relocating some overly adventurous snails. You don't want a snail catching your audience's eye instead of the hardscape and plants. The perfect photo comes down to getting your fish to school in the right place, so a still image still feels alive and the scape feels like it's in balance with the fish. So I mentioned earlier that we'd come back to why adding light to your aquarium is so important. Well, the answer really comes down to how your camera sees your aquarium. See, even the most high-end aquariums look low light to a camera. That's why whenever I photograph an aquarium, I actually bring additional lights. It's just impossible to recreate what the sun puts out. So adding more and more lights is a critical step to getting a good photo. To combat the limitations of shooting indoors with man-made light, your camera has 3 settings that you can tinker with: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. We're going to start with shutter speed because it's the one that you have the least control over, at least in this situation. See, shutter speed has to do with how long a photo is taken for. 1/1000th of a second is a relatively short shutter speed, whereas 1/10th of a second is a pretty long shutter speed. And a 1/10th second shutter speed lets in 100 times more light than a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. So you'd think you'd want the 1/10th of a second because we want as much light hitting our sensor as possible. The problem is we have fish, and fish move, which means that if the shutter speed is too long, you end up with a motion blur across your aquarium rather than a fish. So I recommend a shutter speed of between 1/100th and 1/200th of a second. The next setting your camera gives you to play with is ISO. ISO is how sensitive your sensor is. An ISO of 100 is far less sensitive than an ISO of 10,000. If you're shooting in a dark location like a fish room, a high ISO is a great way to simulate shooting with much more light. The problem is that high ISO also comes with a huge amount of noise being introduced into your photo. If you want the photos of your aquarium to look good, know the limits of your camera. If you have a professional camera, you could shoot with a higher ISO, but this consumer level camera, this is a what am I saying? This is a Nikon D5300. This is what I actually shot this whole video on. The Nikon D5300 is a consumer level camera. I would never shoot with an ISO above about 400 with this camera because you're just going to introduce too much noise. The only other control that you have to compensate for low light is aperture. Aperture is how open or closed your lens is. An aperture of 1.8 or 2.4 means that your lens is wide open. As much light as possible is hitting your sensor. Whereas a aperture of say 11 or 22, your aperture is as closed as possible. That means just a little pinprick of light is hitting your sensor. You'd think that'd mean you'd always want your lens wide open. But having your lens open comes with a consequence. Your depth of field decreases down to just a little teeny sliver of your aquarium. So when taking a photo of your aquarium, you want to find the aperture where your lens is open as much as possible and the entire aquarium is still in focus. You don't want a situation where the foreground or the background of your photo is completely blurry just because you wanted to get enough light into your sensor. Everything your camera can do to compensate for low light comes with a consequence. Maybe it's more noise, maybe it's blurry fish, or maybe it's a blurry foreground and background. That's why adding light is so important. Rather than trying to tinker with your camera, just pump light into that aquarium. Not all the time, just when you're photographing it. In the future, I'm going to do a whole series on how to photograph an aquarium, from lighting the tank, to photographing it, to post-processing the images you get. So if you're interested in that, hit subscribe. And if this video was helpful to you, consider supporting me on Patreon, or buy one of these fancy shirts. I will see you next time.